Hello and Tesla everyone. I welcome you all to the first chapter of the book 1 of your political science subject, that is Cold War and the Non-Aligned Movement. In this clip, I'll be discussing about the emergence of two power blocks after the World War II, the causes of the Cold War, the two alliances, and the reasons for the countries to join or enter these alliances. But before we move on with the actual learning, let's look at the syllabus first. This has been taken from the CBSE website. It has both the old contents as well as the new contents. The CBSE board hasn't done much change in the first chapter besides the removal of the arenas of the Cold War and India and the Cold War. Now, having understood the syllabus, let's jump right in with our lesson. Emergence of Cold War. Now, Cold War was one of the most important phase in the 20th century that ruled the history for almost 4.5 decades. The Cold War went from 1945, that was after the Second World War, and it went on till 1991, that ruled and shaped the world. Okay, the end of the Cold War is usually seen as the beginning of the contemporary era. Now, what is Cold War and how did it emerge? In order to understand that, we need to go back to the history of World War II. Okay, the World War II, which was fought between the two forces, that is, number one, the Allied forces, which consisted of USA, USSR, Britain, and France, and the second forces, which was the Axis forces, which consisted of Japan, Italy, and Germany.
Finish it off once and for all.
The Second World War started in 1939 and it went on for 6 long years and ended in 1945. The Second World War was of course won by the Allied forces. As you can see in the timeline, the World War II started in 1939 after Germany attacked and conquered Poland. The black color represents the Axis and the blue Allied forces. The red color is USSR, who joined Allied forces only in June 1941. The United States also joined the World War II only in December 1941 after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. You can see the progress of the World War II from 1939, the rapid invasion by Germany, and later the flip side after the United States entered the World War and USSR joins the Allied forces. So the World War II was fought between the Allied forces and the Axis forces. However, with the victory of the Allied forces, on the Second World War, it also led to the emergence of the two superpowers within the Allied forces. Okay, that is the USA and the USSR. Now, these two superpowers were rival to each other due to various reasons, which we'll learn in the later slides. Now, they expanded their sphere of influence in different parts of the world. Okay, it threatened to divide the whole world into two parts. This map has been taken from your textbook. As you can see in this map, the countries, which is yellow in color, they took the side of the United States and were called the Western Alliance. Okay, and those in the Eastern Europe, painted in red color, took the side of the USSR and were called the Eastern Alliance. Okay, and look at the key down below. The Western Alliance is also known as the First World, the Eastern Alliance, the Second World, and the Asian and NAM countries, the Third World, which we'll do later. Now, these blocks were also known by different names. Besides Western Alliance, it was also known as Capitalist Bloc, since the United States holds the ideology of capitalism, and they were also referred to as First World, which I just mentioned earlier. for the USSR bloc, besides Eastern Alliance, it was also known as Communist bloc, since they believed in the ideology of communism, and were also referred to as Second World. Okay, again, which I said earlier. The Asian and African countries were referred to as Third World. So you can see that there was a lot of difference between these two power blocks, especially in terms of ideology. Besides ideology, there was also a huge competition between these two superpowers in terms of military, politics, which led to the emergence of Cold War between these two. We'll do those in detail later. So, although there was a lot of tensions and confrontations between these two power blocks, but it never turned into a full-scale war, or what you call a hot war. Okay, so the Cold War, then what is Cold War? So Cold War refers to the competition, the tension, and a series of confrontations between the United States and the Soviet Union, backed by their respective allies. Or in other simple words, you can just say that the Cold War was an ideological, political, and military competition between the capitalist US and the socialist USSR. Now, the next question that comes to our mind is, when the United States and the USSR, when they were in one group, that is the Allied forces, fighting against the other group, the Axis forces, during the World War II, then what caused the tension and why the division which led to the Cold War? In other words, what were the reasons for the Cold War, or what were the causes of the Cold War? So the causes were, number one, we have the difference in ideologies. Now, the United States and the Soviet, they represent two opposing systems of government. All right, the United States, they believed in the ideology of liberal democracy, as in terms of political system. In terms of political system, they believe in democracy, and in terms of economy, they believe in capitalism. Now, capitalism is a market-based economy. Okay, the capitalist economic model, it relies on free market conditions. The production of goods and services is based on the supply and demand in the general market. So, in a capitalist economy, the property and businesses are owned and controlled by individuals. So here, in simple words, here the government's role is minimum. Okay, in the case of capitalist form of economy. Now, the USSR, they represented the ideology of socialism and communism. In a socialist economic model, the production of goods and services is either partially or fully regulated by the government. In a socialist economy, the state owns and controls the major means of production. So, in a nutshell, to make it simple, the capitalist ideal is what is where the government plays very little role in the economy, and in the socialist model, or the socialist ideal, is that where the government plays the leading role in the economy. Okay, now the problem is, both the powers having different ideologies, now they believed that their ideology is better than the other, and they wanted to spread their own ideology to the other parts of the world. So that was the major problem. Second one we have is the disagreement regarding the post-war security. Now, the United States, since it believed in democracy, they wanted the countries to have democratic government and resolve differences peacefully through international organizations. Whereas the USSR, since it held the ideology of communism, was of the belief of increasing security by controlling the internal affairs of countries that bordered it. So there was a difference, regarding the post-war security as well. The third one we have is the power rivalry. Now, after the Second World War, with the decline of Europe, power, of course, was largely shared by the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, the United States, they wanted to dominate USSR, and of course, the USSR, they wanted to dominate the United States to emerge as more powerful than the other. So, in such a competition for power, of course, conflict was natural. Okay. The fourth one we have is the policies against one another. So as described in the earlier points, both held completely different ideologies. It's very important to remember this. And both wanted to spread their sphere of influence, or they wanted to spread their ideology. So in such a situation, they adopted different methods, such as adopting various policies against the other to attract the countries to join their alliance. For example, we have Truman Doctrine. Now, Truman Doctrine was a military aid program, or it was a policy by the United States which was aimed to contain spread of communism. Now, under this policy, the United States provided political, military, and economic help to all those democratic nations which were facing the threat of communism internally or externally. For example, under this policy, it provided aid to Turkey and Greece. All right, and then we have the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan again was also a foreign policy of United States. Now this policy was an economic aid program, unlike the Truman Doctrine, which was more focused on military. Okay, so Truman was more of a military pact, and the Marshall Plan was more of an economic aid program. So under the Marshall Plan, the United States, they extended massive economic aid. They gave major economic aid for the revival of Europe's economy, which was devastated by the world wars. It was said that the aid was open to all the European countries, even those countries who were aligned or who were under the influence of the Soviet Union, and even to the Soviet Union itself as well, which of course the Soviet Union rejected. Then the final one we have is the Molotov Plan. Now, in response to the Marshall Plan, of course, Marshall Plan was rejected by the Soviet Union. So in response to the Marshall Plan, the Soviet came up with Molotov Plan, which of course was an economic aid to rebuild the countries in Eastern Europe, which were allied to them. So these policies, it created suspicions between the two superpowers, and it further intensified their tensions and rivalry. Now, during the Cold War, as I told you earlier, the difference between the two power blocks, it threatened to divide the whole world into two blocks, the Western Alliance and the Eastern Alliance. The division, as I mentioned earlier, it started from Europe, and you can already see in the map the two alliances, the US alliance, which is blue in color, and the USSR alliance, which is red in color. But the question is, what could be the reason for the formation of these alliances? What could be the reason for the smaller countries to join the alliances? And what could be the reasons, for the superpowers to enter alliances? Why the need of alliances? So let's come on and see the reasons. Now, the reasons, first we have the reasons for smaller countries to join alliances. So the reasons for the smaller countries to join alliances were because the smaller states, by remaining tied to one of the superpowers or by joining the alliances, get all means of protection, especially against the stronger neighboring countries. And then second one we have is the economic aid. Many of the countries were economically devastated due to the wars. So in order to revive and develop, they of course need economy, right? So one of the advantage of joining alliance was they also get economic aids. For example, as I just mentioned earlier, the Marshall Plan or say Molotov Plan, okay? And besides economic aid, they also get weapons or military aid like the Truman Doctrine, under which United States extended aid to Turkey and Greece. So the countries, they could use these weapons and military aid for their security, especially against their stronger neighboring countries. Now, the reasons for the superpowers to enter alliances. In case of the superpowers, the reasons were the superpowers, first, they got resources such as minerals and oil from the allies. Then, they also get territory for launching their weapons and troops, as, in the case of Cuban Missile Crisis, where the USSR kept missiles in Cuba. So the superpowers, they also used the smaller, states as a location to spy on each other. So the smaller countries were also used for spying reasons. And by having allies, they also receive economic support to pay for their military expenses. And then we have one of the most important reasons, that is the ideological reasons. Now, as mentioned earlier, since the two superpowers differed in their ideology and they wanted to spread their ideology, so they used all means to spread their ideology, for example, through different policies such as the Truman Doctrine, which we discussed earlier. The loyalty of allies shows that the superpowers were winning the war of ideas as well. So therefore, the allies also becomes important for them. And finally, the number of small states also determines who is more powerful. In some cases, the superpowers even used military forces to include, smaller states under them. Okay. So these were the reasons for the superpowers to enter alliances. We'll do a quick recap. So in this clip, we talked about the United States and the USSR, how they got divided from the Allied forces after the Second World War and emerged as two superpowers. We also learned the various names by which they were referred to. As for the US bloc, they were also called the Western Alliance, Capitalist Bloc, and the First World. And as for the USSR, they were known as Eastern Bloc, Communist Bloc, and the Second World. We then learned about the various differences and competition between these two superpowers, especially in their ideology, which led to the Cold War and the formation of alliances, or rather the causes of the Cold War. Now, the US held the ideology of democracy and capitalism, and the USSR communist and socialist. Because of the differences in ideology, they had different views on the post-war security. They also adopted various policies, as in the case of United States, the Truman Doctrine, which was focused on military aid, and the Marshall Plan, which was an economic aid. And in response to it, the Molotov Plan by the USSR, which created suspicions amongst the two powers, and it further intensified their rivalry. We then learned about how the world got divided into alliances starting from Europe, and the reasons, as in the case of smaller countries, to join the alliances for protection, economic and military aid, and the superpowers to enter alliances for resources, territory for spying and launching weapons, and of course to spread their ideology. Okay, so in the next clip, we'll learn about how these alliances were consolidated through pacts and the arms race, which eventually resulted in various arms treaties. I hope you have understood the part that I explained today. Should you have any concerns, you can always write to me. So until I meet you in my next video, stay safe and take care. Thanks for watching. Bye.